Well, I think one thing we really need to consider is reform to the court system. So, to me, this sort of the assassination of the Archduke moment here is the Merrick Garland fiasco, in which Republicans stole the swing seat on the Supreme Court. There's a conservative majority on the court right now that's about to issue verdict after verdict that's going to cut into our political power, and they stole that seat. Like Neil Gorsuch is illegitimate. And it points to the way that the Republicans have been escalating these court wars, by manipulating the sort of vagueness, the lack of specificity in the Constitution about the procedure by which the president gets to make these appointments. The Constitution says advice and consent by the Senate. That's all it says, right? So Republicans were right when they said, we're not legally obligated to consider this nomination. And to me, there's really no moral or ethical difference between stealing the swing seat and coming into power and adding justices to the court, because the Constitution doesn't say 9. It doesn't say anything, right? The Constitution is actually incredibly vague about the powers of the courts. And there is a movement afoot on the judicial right to do a lot of crazy things. There is a right-wing court packing plan out there by a guy named Steve Calabrese. He's a law professor at Northwestern, one of the leading figures in the originalist movement. They're talking about jurisdiction stripping. That's, Congress passes a law that says Supreme Court can't rule about abortion. You had Ted Cruz and John McCain and Richard Burr all, before the election, endorsed the idea of holding seats on the Supreme Court open so that Hillary Clinton couldn't fill them. So there's a lot worse coming at us down the pike if we don't act first. And because it's within our legal power to add seats to the Supreme Court, to enlarge the federal judiciary and pack it with, the most outrageous set of liberals that we can get our hands on, who are like, 35-year-old Doogie Howsers. I think that's exactly what we have to do. And one of the things that we have on our side here is that, as Democrats have won the popular vote for the presidency 6 of the last 7 elections. By all rights, there should already be a liberal majority on the court. If you add up all the Senate votes, we've won 30 million more votes than Republicans since 1992. So the American people have spoken very clearly, right? They want living constitutionalists on the court who will make law that makes sense for modern society instead of being committed to these 230-year-old design mistakes. So I think it's something we really have to consider, because if we don't do it, it's going to be done to us.
Have the Democrats already blown this, though? I mean, because you and I know these stats. I share your outrage about Neil Gorsuch as well, and, Merrick Garland. But didn't Barack Obama and haven't the Democrats since then blow this? Because if you and I were to walk out and say the names Merrick Garland, 8 out of 10 people would just look at us as if they had never heard of that. The whole Supreme Court thing, they barely remember it. I would say that Mitch McConnell has brought up the blocking of Merrick Garland in the news far more times than any Democrat I can specifically name, and has taken more credit for it than Democrats have said. Like, this has been a complete abuse of the system. Like, there's no predicate set that they did anything that was as outrageous as we know that it was.
Yeah, I know. And it makes my blood boil. And you're absolutely right. I don't think Democrats did enough to campaign behind it. And when it happened, I mean, I don't know about you, but when it happened, I was like, surely they're going to pay a price for this, right? Like, this should be sort of like transparently obvious.
But they weren't paying a price in real time. I mean, the real price would have been Barack Obama saying, all right, you're going to reject Merrick Garland? Here's the next guy. Here's the next woman. Here's the next one, and just keep putting up new people so there was a story every day that had to be covered, but it just went away.
Yeah, I mean, it was depressing the way that the party kind of resigned itself to this situation, and I think that they assumed that Republicans would pay a price in November, and I think as it became clear that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee, they were like, well, whatever, we're going to get to fill the seat anyway, And that's just not what happened. But I think the fact that it didn't happen, there's a lesson in there for us too, right? Which is that we can do this. We can return the favor. And in all likelihood, the public is going to forget about it, And not just that. I mean, I think there's an added benefit that kind of doing a real hardball move here will get our base excited. We'll show them that we're willing to fight for the courts in the same way that the Republicans are.
This is a broader question, but it applies in this instance, and it applies to some of the other things as we get sort of higher up that tree and go for the higher hanging fruit. Democrats I mean, if you look at a comparison between Democrats and Republicans in terms of polling, in terms of the question of compromise, right? And we can, and I don't know if there's been, I mean, how deeply or how granular questions around this idea of compromise have been asked. But consistently over the years, it seems to me that Democrats want their politicians to compromise. I mean, I think at one point it was like 75% of Democrats want their politicians to compromise, whereas Republicans, it's like 20% want them to compromise. The other 80% want them to, come hell or high water, be ideological and intransigent. How do we deal with that problem? And do you think that problem still exists?
I do think it still exists. I think it's on the decline. I mean, I think you can see over the past year that the energy and the sort of the policy energy on the activist left is behind obstruction. We saw this with the DACA fight, where I think a lot of the activist organizations took this really, really hard line, including people I thought were pretty pragmatic overall, like Indivisible, who were like, just like shut it down, right? We need to get this done. And I think that message went over really well with the base. I do think you're right. I think that Democrats generally expect more compromise from their leadership than Republicans at this point too. But I mean that's an opportunity for us too, because the second piece of the court plan is to first offer a kind of an olive branch to the Republicans, and that olive branch would be a constitutional amendment. And the constitutional amendment would do a few things, right? Most importantly, it would cap service on the Supreme Court at 18 years, and it would give every president the right in every 4-year term to appoint 2 justices to the court. And you could do a lot of other things with that amendment. Like you could actually spell out what the Senate's obligations are. You could say, okay, you can reject one person. You have to consider the second. And if you reject the second, the president can fill the seat unilaterally. So there's all sorts of maneuvers that you can put in that amendment so that it reduces the temperature around these court wars and sort of takes them off the table as a major partisan battle. Now, I think that that'll be rejected by the Republican leadership, right? But it'll show our coalition, like, hey, we tried this bipartisan compromise. They said no, and this is what we're going to do instead. So we have the moral high ground, and then we also play the hardball. If the moral high ground is abandoned by our adversaries, then we fill it with what we want to fill it with.